Hello. In this slideshow presentation, students from the Cooperstown Graduate Program in Cooperstown, New York have compiled information on the subject of cultural property protection. We hope that you find it to be useful and informative. What is cultural property to you? The 1954 Hague Convention defined cultural property as movable or immovable property of great importance to the cultural heritage of every people. Take a moment to think about those things that are important to your and other people's cultural heritage. Here we see the Statue of Liberty, and behind it Ellis Island and downtown Manhattan in New York City. Monticello, which was the plantation and home of Thomas Jefferson in Charlottesville, Virginia. The Black Hills mountain range in South Dakota. Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. The Apollo Theater in Harlem, New York City. Or the Grand Canyon. The Civil Affairs Arts, Monuments, and Archives Guide, produced in 2009 by the United States Army, further defines cultural property as non-renewable remains or products of human activity or occupation, the tangible representation of significant human events, beliefs, and values. Cultural property is those items of intrinsic value to a group of people. Examples of different types of spaces and objects that can be considered cultural property include historic buildings, such as the White House, works of art, like the Mona Lisa, archaeological sites, like the Roman Forum, shipwrecks, such as the USS Arizona, museum and library collections, like the Metropolitan Museum in New York City. And finally, sacred places. Here you see the Vatican City in Rome. Keep in mind that while the examples we've just been shown are better known within Western culture in the United States and Europe, there are many more examples of those cultural objects, locations, and symbols that are just as much, if not more important and valuable to people all around the world. The possible locations are limitless, but to name a few from the UNESCO World Heritage Sites list: the Great Barrier Reef, the city of Florence, Machu Picchu, Virunga National Park, and Redwood Forest National Park.
Why does cultural property matter? I've outlined a few reasons here about why cultural property is so important and how it relates to you as soldiers. First, it's a human right. This is probably the most abstract idea on my list, so let's use an example that's a little bit closer to home to help illustrate the concept. Imagine for a second a quintessential American experience, a 4th of July party. It's a nice summer day, there's hot dogs on the grill, maybe some games in the backyard with family. The 4th of July isn't a physical object, but it's an extremely important part of being an American. A closely related object would be the American flag. Now, imagine for a moment that an enemy group has destroyed the American flag. Technically, they have only destroyed a piece of fabric, but in actuality, they have attacked everything that we associate with that flag, from the backyard 4th of July picnic to the very concept of independence that the flag stands for. That's the type of relationship that can exist between a physical thing and fundamental concepts of identity and personal freedom. In the Middle East, particularly around Iraq and Afghanistan, it's been called the cradle of civilization by historians for a long time because that's where civilization as we know it was first seen. That means that each and every one of us, from me to the folks you'll encounter while on deployment and all of you watching this video, has some stake in the stuff that can be found there. It's all a part of our collective human history, and it's a human right for all of us to have access to this collective world heritage. While some other places that you might go might not be quite as old as what you'll encounter in the Middle East, this idea still applies in other places. Next, protecting cultural property fosters better relationships with the local people. As a part of the Civil Affairs Division, one of your many jobs is to create better relationships with indigenous populations. It's going to make your job a lot easier if you can prevent the destruction of property that those people hold in very high regard. Local groups will be much more willing to help you, or at least less likely to cause problems, if they see you making an active attempt at protecting their heritage. Looting funds terrorist organizations and helps to further their goals. One of ISIS's main objectives is to destroy any cultures that aren't like them. So when they go into a new place, they seek out cultural property specifically in order to eradicate it and replace it with their own culture. By providing cultural property protection, you are directly opposing ISIS's goals. Also, ISIS employs professional looters. These are people that are paid to find cultural property that's worth a lot of money on the black market and then sell it. The object will probably never be found again because, let's face it, these guys are good at their jobs. The money from these stolen objects then goes back into weapons, munitions, soldiers, further training for ISIS. So while looting might seem like it only fosters personal goals of wealth and fame, it can also help achieve military objectives that put US soldiers and their allies at risk. Post-war reconstruction and economic recovery. This is a pretty basic concept. The less stuff that's destroyed, the less that needs to be rebuilt after the conflict has ended. In places that were tourist destinations before the conflict, that means a faster recovery time and tourists will return to stimulate the economy. That ultimately means that you have to spend less time and resources helping the area to recover from the conflict and can focus your attention on other things. Finally, protecting cultural property is the law. There have been conventions and meetings for years discussing the legalities of protecting cultural property. The next portion of this video will help break down these laws to help you understand them better.
The Lieber Code of 1863 defined guidelines for how soldiers should conduct themselves in wartime and was an important precursor to later international agreements. It defined cultural property as personal property that should be, quote, secured against avoidable injury. The 1907 Hague Convention was an early international agreement that included provisions regarding cultural property. It required belligerent parties to spare religious buildings, museums, monuments, and hospitals from damage or attack, but this protection would be waived if those buildings were used offensively. The 1907 Hague Convention also called for cultural property to be indicated with signs and defined cultural property protection as a joint responsibility for all sides in a conflict. The 1907 Hague Convention was proved to be ineffective by the destruction of World War I, and in 1925, the United States and 20 other nations signed a Pan-American agreement called the Roerich Pact, which called for broader cultural property protection, including for historic sites, art, science institutions, and educational sites. It called for signatories to respect and protect those sites, and for lists of sites to be protected to be exchanged in the event of armed conflict. Following the widespread destruction of World War II, a movement emerged to create broader protections for cultural property and define specific, agreed-upon guidelines for its protection. The protocols which resulted from the 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of an armed conflict are the major international agreement governing the protection of cultural property today. The 1954 Hague Protocols have been ratified by 128 nations. As defined under the 1954 Hague Protocols, cultural property protection is an obligation for all sides in a conflict. Parties agree to refrain from using cultural property for defensive purposes or in any way likely to expose it to damage. Defending parties must mark cultural property sites with a blue shield emblem, and all sides in an armed conflict agree to take action to prevent looting and vandalism. In an occupation situation, occupiers must work with the authorities of occupied states to protect cultural property. The 1954 Hague Convention also established an international register for cultural property. In 1999, the second protocol of the Hague Convention expanded the scope of cultural property protection and shifted the main responsibility for protection to the attacking forces in a conflict. Nations must take care to avoid incidental damage to cultural property and work to prohibit and prevent the export of items from looted cultural sites. So far, 28 nations have ratified the second protocol of the Hague Convention. Intentional destruction of cultural property is a serious criminal offense. Ahmad al-Faqi al-Mahdi, a member of Ansar ad-Din associated with al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, was the first individual charged with cultural property destruction in the International Criminal Court in The Hague. In 2012, 9 mausoleums and 1 mosque in Timbuktu, Mali, were destroyed under his instruction. At his trial, al-Mahdi admitted his guilt. He faced a sentence of up to 30 years imprisonment, but because of his admission of guilt, he was sentenced to 9 years in prison in order to pay 2.7 million euros in reparations. Thank you for watching. We hope you have found this segment defining cultural property, why it matters, and the legal background surrounding cultural property useful. Please look for the next video, outlining more of the history of cultural property protection.